Welcome, everyone. My name is Arek Burakovsky, and I manage the Russia and Eurasia program here at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. We're pleased to organize this event in partnership with the American Academy of Diplomacy, AAD. It's an independent nonprofit association of former senior U.S. ambassadors and high-level government officials whose mission is to strengthen American diplomacy. Sorry about the screen. Let's see if we can fix that. We'll just leave it like this for now. We're honored today to host Ambassador Tatiana Gfoeller at Fletcher. This conversation will build upon a podcast episode of The General and the Ambassador, which she previously recorded with General Blaine Holt. General Holt and Ambassador Gfoeller described their efforts to keep the Manas base in Central Asia as an air bridge for the U.S. effort in Afghanistan during the local coup, violent ethnic cleansing, and managing competing Russian and Chinese interests. They underlined the importance of U.S. influence in this volatile region, including stemming Islamic extremism. We're also delighted to collaborate on this event with the staff of the Fletcher Forum of World Affairs, a student-managed foreign policy journal at Fletcher. They interviewed Ambassador Gfoeller today, and they recently launched the summer 2022 print edition of the journal titled Contemporary Armed Conflict. I will now give the floor to them to briefly introduce the latest issue of the journal.
Thank you, Arek, and thank you, Ambassador Gfoeller, for agreeing to allow us to partner with you on this event. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lily Hartzell, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Fletcher Forum of World Affairs. As many of you might know, we are the premier student-run foreign policy journal here at Fletcher. We were founded in 1975, almost 50 years ago, and we strive to provide a platform for the discussion of legal, political, economic, environmental, and diplomatic issues in international affairs. Today, we are very proud to be launching our summer 2022 edition. Its theme, as Arek mentioned, is contemporary armed conflict. It's of obvious relevance to so much of what we're witnessing playing out globally and then in the classroom at Fletcher today. While we'd hoped, I think many of us had hoped that the new age of peace ushered in by the collapse of the Soviet Union would last, we are instead faced with a situation in which our attention is torn among the ongoing civil war in Ethiopia and Yemen, the state-sanctioned violence in Afghanistan and Myanmar, and of course, Russia's brutal war in Ukraine. It's only a few. As Ambassador Gfoeller can attest, Central Asia has seen its fair share of such conflicts in recent decades, including the flare-up of border clashes between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan earlier this year. Our latest edition attempts to put all of these global events into context through an examination of the means and methods of warfare, its humanitarian consequences, and the role of unconventional actors. It ends with several perspectives on the future of warfare so we can begin to chart a path. We are honored to include contributions from a range of experts and practitioners, including Fletcher's own professor of practice, Tara Sonnenschein, who writes about drones in the global information age. A couple quick thank yous before I turn the floor back to Arek. Special credit for this issue is due to my predecessor, Delia Burns, and our managing print editor, Anna Brader, for creating one of the finest and most relevant issues the forum's ever published. When they chose this theme earlier this year, Russia had yet to invade Ukraine. Here we are today. We are very proud of their work, and we are excited to share these with all of you. We are also deeply grateful to the Russia and Eurasia program for their support in covering our printing costs and in partnering with us on a variety of initiatives to cover the war in Ukraine and publish voices from the Russian and Ukrainian diaspora. We're excited at the prospect of continued collaboration with the program. We will have copies of our print edition available, which I meant to hold up to all of you to see, so you'll have to come outside to the lobby and see them in person for yourselves.
We can CGI that in later.
Yeah, exactly. We'll have those available for purchase, and we would love for you to stop by. I'd also like to take a moment to encourage you to visit our website, fletcherforum.org, and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. We have a whole range of content, the gamut of issues in international affairs that's available exclusively online as well as edition. So thank you again to all of you, and particularly to Arek, and I'll turn things back to you.
All right, can I just make one thing? So on Monday, Professor of Practice Tara Sonnenschein will be with the Center for Strategic Studies presenting in the Engaging Practitioners Seminar. And she'll be talking about the article that she has in this Fletcher Forum edition. So lots of good things.
Yeah, lots of ways to engage.
So
Thanks,
please
Professor.
email me if you want to come to that and we'll send this to you. On my pleasure.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm now pleased to introduce our esteemed guest speaker, Ambassador Gfoeller. Ambassador Tatiana Gfoeller most recently served as foreign policy advisor to two successive members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. She served as an advisor to the Chief of Staff of the Army from 2011 to 2015, and to the Chief of the National Guard Bureau from 2015 to 2017. She currently serves as president of the American Women for International Understanding, a global women's rights NGO. From 2008 to 2011, she served as U.S. Ambassador to the Kyrgyz Republic. She was responsible for all aspects of U.S. policy in Kyrgyzstan, including support for the U.S. war effort in Afghanistan, counterterrorism, and counter-narcotics. During her 33-year career with the U.S. Department of State and the Department of Defense, she served as Consul General in Saudi Arabia, Consul General in St. Petersburg, Russia, and Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires in Turkmenistan. She also served as advisor on the former Soviet Union to the Secretary General of NATO. Her other overseas assignments include Warsaw, Poland, Moscow, Manama, Bahrain, and Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Ambassador Gfoeller will be interviewed by two of our distinguished and revered professors. I'm delighted to introduce them. Daniel Drezner is Professor of International Politics and co-director of the Russia and Eurasia program at Fletcher. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. His research focuses on economic statecraft, U.S. grand strategy, global political economy, and power in world politics. Monica Toft is Professor of International Politics and Director of the Center for Strategic Studies at Fletcher. Before joining Fletcher, she taught at Oxford University's Blavatnik School of Government and Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Her research focuses on U.S. foreign and national security policy, interstate and civil wars, territory and nationalism, demography, and religion in global politics. I will now turn it over to our two co-chairs. They will each pose several questions to Ambassador Gfoeller, after which they will take some questions from the audience. So please.
Thank you very much, Ark. Thank you all for coming. If you haven't yet, I would strongly urge you to listen to the podcast episode that is going to inspire some of the questions we've asked. Really, it's a roller coaster ride in terms of what Ambassador Gfoeller had to do in order to keep the Manas space open. You know, I think it's sometimes part of Madam Secretary, sometimes it's part of Parks and Recreation, to be honest. But there was a lot of interesting things in there. I think the first question I want to ask you, having listened to the podcast, is to what extent do you think what lessons can you draw from your Bishkek posting that you think apply to any other diplomatic posting, not just those military bases, but just be an ambassador?
Sure. Excellent question. Let me start by just saying I'm really pleased to be here among you, a very distinguished and revered group, I'm sure as well. Thank you for having me. It's a real honor, a real privilege to come and chat with you. But to the question, I think that what can be drawn from my experience in Kyrgyzstan is pretty much the hardest aspect of diplomacy. To give a background, just a very short one for those who did not listen to the podcast. So my job from the very, very highest levels of the State Department is to hold on to the Manas Air Base, because 98% of our men and women in uniform who were entering or exiting Afghanistan for our military effort there were transiting through Manas Air Base, Kyrgyzstan, and our war effort would have been tremendously hampered if we had not held on to the base. So I was told in no uncertain terms in Washington, D.C., hold on to that base. As the professor has said, it was a roller coaster. It was very difficult. I won't go through all the details unless you want me to in later questions. But the main crux of the matter was that Kyrgyzstan is a small country. I mean, small relatively speaking. It's the size of Montana, but still small. It's poor. It's around 96% mountainous. It has no natural resources except for hydro. And that is controversial because everybody wants to grab their water. And it's sandwiched, most importantly, between basically the Chinese and Russian spheres of influence. It became very obvious very early in that tenure that Russia was doing all it could to kick us out of the base. They were making no secret about it. They were quite vociferous. What was much more interesting, frankly, and surprising was that the Chinese were doing as much as the Russians, if not more than the Russians. But they were keeping quiet. This is, I hate to say it, but rather characteristic of the Chinese way of diplomacy versus the Russian way of diplomacy in quotes when it comes to Russia. So I realized early on that I wasn't just battling the Russians, I was battling the two most important countries in my region, who were working sometimes in concert, sometimes not in concert on their own, but obviously for a common goal, getting us out of the base. So that's a pretty tall order. How do you counter the two most important countries in the world? I had to give it a lot of thought, and to put it mildly. And this is where I came out with a strategy that I think is applicable to all diplomatic missions in all regions. Is once you've ascertained who your adversary is or are, if you don't want to go to war, which obviously I'm a little bit prejudiced against war, I'm a diplomat by training, right? I'm not a Clausewitzian who says that war is diplomacy by other means. No, by no means is it. As the professor who has studied humanitarian effects of war, I'm sure will attest, war is completely different from diplomacy. So if you don't want to go to war, what do you do? And I think the very crux of diplomacy is you have to persuade your adversaries that it is actually in their interest to share your interest. That is very difficult to do, as you can imagine. And in a overheated situation, which it already was then, now it's obviously much more overheated than then, but still in an overheated situation between the US, China, and Russia, to try and get Russia and China to agree that it was in their interest for the United States to keep Manas Air Base was challenging, to say the least. And so I tried to sort of puzzle this out. You know, what could I say to my ambassadorial counterparts to persuade them? And what do we have in common in the region was kind of the bottom line. And the bottom line at that time, I'm not saying this is applicable to today's politics, but at that time, the bottom line was all three countries were against Islamic terrorism, extremism. All three countries had challenges with these issues and were trying to figure out how to tamp them down. And all three countries basically wanted stability. So my approach to both the Chinese and the Russian ambassador was, look, if we fail in Afghanistan, if you do succeed in kicking us out of Manas, at first the Chinese ambassador was like, no, we're not even trying to do that. And I was like, please, just hear me out here. With the Russian, it was easier. It was like, yeah, absolutely, we're going to kick you out of Manas. So I'm like, okay, great. But imagine that you succeed in doing this. What will be the consequence? Afghanistan will fall to the Taliban. Pretty obvious. The Taliban is itself pretty extremist and Islamic, and certainly has harbored very extremist Islamic organizations on its soil. So you, right on your border, or very close to your border, will have incredible amounts of instability and potential terrorism action. We right now, we the United States, are taking the brunt of the action. Our men and women are dying, not yours. So for you to try to kick us out is exactly counter to your interests. We are doing something that you need us to do. Just let us get on with our job, and you will reap the benefits thereof, because we don't want to conquer China or Russia. We're just trying to bring stability to your area. And by the way, you know, maybe we could use a little help. But that was just an ironic sidebar, because we didn't really want their help. We just wanted them to get out of the way for us to be able to get on with our job. And, you know, it worked. they came around and they agreed with me in the end that, you know what? We really benefit from the presence here. So we'll do some cosmetic changes. We changed the name from Air Base to the Transit Center. We increased the rent that we paid for the base. But all these were really cosmetic things. So the crux of the matter was to persuade our would-be adversaries that it was in their interest to do what we want. And I think that can, not easily, of course, but the premise can be translated pretty much anywhere. Because if you're ambassador to pretty much any country, you will have some people who will not agree with American policy, who will want to, not maybe as dramatically as kick you out of a base, but still not facilitate what US foreign policy is trying to achieve in that country. And so you need to ascertain who these people are. They may be their countries, maybe they're individuals, maybe they're movements. So who are they? What do they want? And try and find a common interest with them, where you can say, I, as the American ambassador, see where you're coming from. We have this common interest. What I'm trying to achieve is actually partly beneficial to you, not maybe 100% beneficial, of course not, but partly. So I would say that's the main lesson that I learned from my experience.
I'm curious, I mean, most US bases, I mean, that's just sort of an outlier. Most US military bases that are overseas, and we have a lot of them, you know, are located on what would be considered either treaty allies or long-standing allies. In that way, do you feel like the diplomatic work you had to do to keep the mouths open was typical or atypical compared to, you know, the work you would have had to do if you were, let's say, posted to Germany or to Saudi Arabia?
Certainly atypical. As you mentioned, this was a very controversial kind of geographical location. In most cases, indeed, our bases are located in treaty-based countries. Now, that doesn't mean that things cannot deteriorate. Let's take the example of Turkey, which is nominally a NATO ally. No, it certainly doesn't seem to be 100% like a NATO ally these days. And if you will recall, and obviously we can debate this, it's not my bailiwick to do so, the wisdom of our invasion of Iraq. If you will recall, though, and this is a point I think is very important, the Turks, though NATO allies, refused us access to Incirlik Air Base, even though it's quote unquote our base. I mean, we're there, our stuff is there, our people are there, but the treaty country, NATO ally, refused us usage of Incirlik, which at the time was quite detrimental for our military efforts. We had to come from much further away, and it took us more time, et cetera, and much more money, et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes that happens, but usually not, because usually, again, you know, what do we have in common here with Germany? The history is that we provided incredible security against the USSR. So it was in their interest for our base to be there. You know, and over and over again, we cite examples of that. So there again, you have a common interest. They need us there, they benefit from our presence, and we have our base. So that's all good. Now, obviously in Kyrgyzstan, that was different, and I had a much harder time persuading everybody of the common interests. Another thing I'd like to point out in Kyrgyzstan is that the base was so important and so autonomous to the DoD effort that it was not under chief of mission authority. Now, for example, my military headship was under my authority. I could fire him if I wanted to, and indeed I did. A little known fact.
So that wasn't in the podcast. I would remember that.
No, I wasn't in the podcast. Well, you know, a small aside, but the bottom line is the base was not under chief of mission authority. So while I was responsible for good relations with Kyrgyzstan, in the United States, and I was responsible for hanging on to the base. I could not tell the base commander what to do. Getting back to the my military attaché whom I fired, well, he was a fine young man whose position I think went a little bit to his head, as happens sometimes. It was his first overseas posting, and he decided that there was no better way of collecting information, because obviously the military attaché, what is he up there for? To collect information to then send back to DoD. He decided that on top of just collecting information and saying, hey, I'm the military attaché, he was going to go around the various attaché meetings, receptions, what have you, to tell everyone that he was a spy. Because he thought that was kind of James Bond-like. And it gave him extra cachet. Well, when word got back to me, as ambassador, I did not hang out with military attaché, but word does get back. Usually to ambassadors, at least if they have their ear to the ground. I called him in and I said, you know, this is a real no-no. This is completely irresponsible, especially when we have this very tense relationship. And we're trying to hold on to the base, and you, a fellow military officer in uniform, are running around saying you're a spy. So please stop. And he didn't stop, so I fired him. Okay, what can you do? He was detrimental to the mission. He was undercutting it. But as for the fact that the base was not under chief of mission authority, I'm here, this wasn't the podcast. We had 3 very unfortunate incidents that happened on the base.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing, but that's some of the.
Yeah, some of them are funny. Well, they weren't funny at the time.
No, I'm sure.
They're funny in retrospect. They happened all before I arrived, and this is where you really kind of feel shafted sometimes, because stuff happens, you have nothing to do with it, but then you pick up the pieces as ambassador every time. So the 3 incidents were, one really tragic. There was a Kyrgyz truck driver who was delivering stuff to the base, and the airman in charge of opening and shutting the door shot him dead, point blank range, for no apparent reason. What complicated the situation much further was that the Kyrgyz truck driver was an ethnic Russian. So that created a huge bad blood with the Russian minority. That's is normal. I mean, I completely understand them. And of course, fueled the Russian demands that we close the base. We never could figure out why this airman behaved the way he did. There were rumors that he had an affair with a Russian truck driver's wife. I don't know. All I know is that I had to meet with the widow. I had to endure, well, obviously a very justified anger on her part. I had to then negotiate with the State Department and the DoD department as to a compensation for her basically paying for her children's pain. I had to deliver the check. None of this was pleasant. All of it was quite tragic, but it was part of my job and I did it. The second incident that we had was not as tragic, but still extremely challenging. The base, correctly, I would say, considering that we had a lot of antics going on, not necessarily about base personnel, but we had some pretty rowdy Marines who come in and out and do all kinds of stuff. So the base was very careful about how much people could get off base. But about once a week, they would have a bus take folks to this noted shopping center so that folks could go and get souvenirs for their families and something like that. So one time the bus went off and everybody got into the shopping center, and one major did not return to the bus and just disappeared into thin air. So that's disturbing. And then this particular major reappeared 3 days later, dressed in completely different clothes, with her hair dyed a completely different color, in a little cabin in the woods, saying that she had been kidnapped by someone who had approached her and said, "I'm carrying a bomb in my knapsack." Well, that's really weird to begin with. But then it got weirder because this Kyrgyz doctor appeared on television and said that this major had come to him and gotten an abortion. So we spirited her out of there ASAP. But then I, as an ambassador, had to endure, countless questions about this. Whenever I gave an interview, the major would come up, even if it was about, Chinese relations with Russia or whatever, the major would pop up. And so that was embarrassing, though not so tragic, because she survived and everything was okay in the end. And then the last incident was simply comic. Though at the time, again, I had to pick up the pieces, but so our base, later transit center, was located on the territory of the Bishkek International Airport. And some American pilot, thought of nothing but running his airplane into the president's airplane, as the president's airplane was parked there. So talk about compensation, talk about an unpleasant meeting with the president, having to profusely apologize to him, but his presidential airplane was now damaged and unusable for a couple of weeks. So that's a long story to get back to the fact that it's very challenging to be an ambassador in a country where there is a base that is not under chief of mission authority, because you can't tell them what to do, and yet you're responsible for all of their misdeeds, at least when it comes to international, relations.
Can I just ask, is the norm that the base would be under chief of mission, or is it the norm that it would?
It depends, but even if it isn't, because the big ones aren't, if it's in a treaty country, if we have great relations, in any case, usually it's not at all as challenging to pick up the pieces. But anyway, just to conclude, so the way I handled that with the base is, as soon as I arrived, I started having the base commander come to our country team meetings every week. We have a country team meeting, all hands on deck, like all of the heads of political section, economic section, and consular section, whatever. And we kind of go over the past week and what are the upcoming challenges for the upcoming week. And usually the base commander would not attend. But I started inviting him every single week to hear, so what's going on at the base? What is the Marine contingent going to be up to when they come next week? And then I would also give him a sense of what's the atmosphere. We have a public diplomacy section. Part of his job was reading the Kyrgyz newspapers, both Russian language and Kyrgyz language, and analyzing kind of what is the temperature regarding the United States. How much criticism is the base coming in for? How many times was the major brought up? And so that was helpful to the base commander, who obviously spoke no Russian, no Kyrgyz, did not have that kind of a public diplomacy section, but it gave him awareness where he could maybe mitigate stuff like that.
Right. So I hadn't realized that so much of diplomacy sounds like parenting.
Yes.
A lot of training on that. So, sticking with sort of the Kyrgyzstan, but moving a little bit to Afghanistan, because the mission was to keep that base, that transit center open in order to facilitate the U.S. engagement there. It's finished a big project in military intervention. And it turns out that the U.S., 25% of intervention happens since 2011. So since 1776, 400 of them, 25% of them happened. So you were sort of in the belly of the beast, right? Helping to do this Afghanistan situation. And we've just passed a year where President Biden decided to pull out American forces. You were desperately pleaded with to keep the space open 13 years ago, 10 years ago. And yet here we have pulled out, complete defeat militarily, you can argue politically, economically, in terms of human rights. So I'd just be curious, as a professional diplomat, lifelong, what could we have done differently? And what should we be thinking about doing now, particularly with the Taliban now in power and failing? And there are some overtures, at least from our allies, to negotiate with them. But what are some of the missteps that you wish had been done?
Well, I completely understand the position of some of our political leaders who say that we can't do a forever war. But we did what we could for 20 years and it was time to leave. I completely get it. However, the way we left is what really, I think could have been handled different. And I'll tell you a little story because when I was I'm an immigrant. I immigrated at the age of 4 from France. And so traditionally, I've always been close to the whatever French embassies in the country I'm stationed in. I'm obviously a French native speaker. Anyway, I have stayed friends with a number of French diplomats through the years, including the French ambassador to Kyrgyzstan. So I get to hear sort of a little bit of the French point of view. And this is just a little vignette. When President Biden announced at the beginning of the year that we would be gone by the end of August, right? The French took note because they're sort of latched up with us. They were part of the coalition. So the French ambassador in Kabul at the time immediately contacted the Quai d'Orsay, which is their equivalent of foreign service, and their DOD, and said, okay, I have a complete list of all French citizens who live in Afghanistan. I have a complete list of all Afghan citizens who are helping these French citizens. It will take, you tell me how long it will take to evacuate everybody. And let's figure out a timetable. A French military aircraft comes every month, every week, every whatever. We get our timetable straight, get everybody out before the end of August, before the Americans leave. Because once the Americans are gone, we don't know what the Americans are going to do for their citizens, but ours are in the soup because they're all seen as basically as collaborators to the American effort. And he also said, you know, my research shows that the Taliban will be taking over Kabul within a couple of weeks of the Americans' withdrawal. So we need to start work on this. He was taken seriously, and this evacuation proceeded apace. Well, then an old colleague of mine, whom I actually know pretty well, who was the American chargé at the time, got wind of this French process of evacuation. So he called in the French ambassador and he said, you have to stop doing this. And the French ambassador said, well, why? And my American colleague said, well, because it sends a message that you think that the current Afghan government will fall, that there will be terrible repercussions on foreign nationals. And this is undermining our effort to kind of have stable relations with the government. And we don't think that the Taliban will take over at least for 6 months. And the Frenchman said, well, I disagree. I think that they will take over within a couple of weeks, and I'm going to proceed with my evacuation. So I think that this was an American failure of intelligence. I mean, if the French knew, the fairly lame French, I hate to say it, knew that the Taliban were going to take over in 2 weeks, how come we didn't know? And I think that part of it was that we just didn't want to face the facts. That happens a lot, unfortunately, in our foreign policy. We want to believe what we want to believe, and if we face a very unpleasant fact, and again, I'm not saying we should have stayed. The forever wars don't work, but at least own what you're doing. Know that, yes, the Taliban will take over. Yes, women will become erased from Afghan consciousness and culture and all that. I mean, own it and at least try and mitigate it. Try and do it somehow more, deftly than we did. Also, I think that here, I'm not an Afghan expert, absolutely not. So I'm even speaking completely out of school. But I have researched a little bit of Afghan history. I've seen the photographs of Afghan women in the 60s wearing miniskirts, going to university. There seems to have been a time when under the Afghan king, Afghanistan was moving in basically a more westernizing direction. Somehow along the way, that fell apart. And I'm wondering, again, I don't know, because I'm not an Afghan expert, was there any way during the 20 years when we were basically in charge, to have tried to nurture, not impose at all, that never works, but nurture those tendencies within Afghan society that had at least existed in the 60s, somehow kind of throw back to that, find out who are these people who were the westernizers? How can we have a dialogue with them? As opposed to just kind of pretending that Afghanistan was always fundamentalist and we're just going to change it. You know what I'm saying? This reminds me of when I was stationed in the Soviet Union. So, you know, it's falling apart. It was around like 1990. We were trying, as part of many fronts of influence on the Soviet Union, to get people to remember their capitalist past. And I would give speeches, for example, in Moscow, talking about the very strong independent commercial aspect of Moscow. Moscow and St. Petersburg have historically had very different sort of characteristics. Moscow could be called the New York, and St. Petersburg the DC. St. Petersburg, all politics, all international relations, all this stuff. Moscow was the powerhouse of the kupci, which is the expression in Russian for businessmen, merchants, trade, you know, apolitical, just let's make some money. And they had at the time, just until the revolution, until the Bolshevik Revolution, Moscow had some very important, powerful guilds of merchants that would band together, that would influence economic policy, that were independent of the Tsar and all this good stuff that was going on in St. Petersburg. That cared about, you know, Russian agriculture, Russian trade, Russian industry, very influential in creating the Russian railroad network, which in 1913 was the fastest growing railroad network in the world. So there were really powerful people who were making a huge amount of difference. And so I would try and remind my audiences of that no, I'm not some American dweeb lecturing you on how you should become a capitalist. Capitalism is in your blood. It was just erased by the communist revolution, but you can come back to your roots. And that's what, if I had a magic wand, I would have wanted to do in Afghanistan. Somehow try to reconnect the Afghan people to their roots, where they were open to women's education. When the equivalent of Tsar, you know, the king, was open to dialogue with us. That's all I can say.
You talk in the podcast, I mean, clearly your top priority was very clear, was maintaining, you know, the base of Manas, making sure there's. And it brings up, there's been a fair amount of international relations research on this sort of, for lack of a way of putting it, the externalities that military bases create for US diplomats. There are often a variety of incidents that happen at bases. We know, you know, and students I'm sure are fully aware, there have been base controversies elsewhere, the US bases in Okinawa, the US bases in Seoul, and so forth. Do you worry, in Kyrgyzstan, clearly your number one, number two, and number three priorities were the base. I guess my question is, do you worry that military bases crowd out in some ways the rest of your, you know, a diplomat's portfolio? Or are there times where you feel like there are diplomat multiple, because you have a base, you know, you have a little more sways?
It's a mixed picture. Definitely they can crowd out, and definitely cultural insensitivity on the part of base personnel can have horrific consequences. As you mentioned, Okinawa, the American servicemen who have committed a number of rapes of local women. It diverts from the relationship. I mean, there you are, you know, dealing with a completely non-international, it should be incident. I mean, a criminal act or rape. And so, yes, it definitely diverts. In some cases, though, well, if it's a treaty country, you know, often there'll be marriages, everything will be nice. The Americans will learn about the local cuisine. I'm thinking of some of our bases in Italy, where things were going really nicely. And in fact, they obviously contribute to the local economy. They themselves learn about the local culture. I mean, it can go very, very well and actually be a sort of force multiplier. In Kyrgyzstan, there were obviously I already mentioned the negative aspects, but there were positive aspects. Kyrgyzstan is home to a number of NGOs, very vibrant NGO community. And the base commander whom I did the podcast with, General Blaine, was acutely sensitive to that. And I hope that partly is thanks to the fact that he came every week to our meetings. And so he lobbied the Defense Department to give him a number of grants, for example, for women's rights organization, for press freedom organizations. He actually got money to create a cooperative of sewing for underprivileged women. And General Petraeus, who was at the time head of Central Command, literally journeyed from his base in Tampa to inaugurate this cooperative. And that gave us some really good publicity. And a very known fact and sad fact is that Defense Department is so much richer than the State Department, so much richer. I mean, and I'm not talking about buying airplanes or stuff like that. Of course, they need a lot of money for that. I'm talking about for programs such as helping NGOs. I mean, that is kind of mind-boggling to me. I'm a prejudiced, obviously, person. But they're sitting on pots of money for women's rights, for women's education, for stuff like that. But often they're not terribly adept at how to use this money. However, if you have a base commander, like I did with General Blaine, who's open and interested, then that is really positive to our relationship.
So, staying with sort of the women-female theme, you're now the president of American Women for International Understanding. And you've had a long career. We've seen a lot of dramatic changes in American society around the world. What was it like to be a female ambassador?
I would think, obviously I haven't been a male ambassador, but I think.
That's true. You've got some
So
long
it's
experience,
not-
some deep field experience.
Many glasses of wine discussing your day. And you
Yes.
believe this happened?
Yeah, definitely there have been those. I do say to all, I mentor a lot of young women who are interested in becoming foreign service officers, some young men as well, by the way. I don't discriminate, but mainly young women. And we've talked about this endlessly. It's a perennial topic, a very interesting topic. Interesting to me and interesting to them, I think. It's for sure a female ambassador there are different expectations of her. Achieving the goal is the same. It doesn't matter what gender you are, you need to hold on to the base. But how you achieve that goal is different. It's a cliche that when a woman shouts, she's hysterical. When a man shouts, he comes across as strong. But there's a lot of truth to that cliche. A woman is expected to do things with more, shall we put it, diplomacy. A woman is supposed to be empathetic. That's like goal number one. You're supposed to come across as empathetic and hopefully be empathetic. That always helps. And you're supposed to address things in a calm, sort of more gentle manner. You're supposed to listen more to your interlocutor or your subordinate. You're supposed to ask their opinion. That's expected of you. You're supposed to, you said something about how being holding on to my base and everything was like raising a family. There is that underlying feeling that a female leader is supposed to act in a more mothering way than a male leader is supposed to be in a fathering way. There really is that. And I think that fighting that is counterproductive. You just figure out the goal. It doesn't matter what gender you are, you're going to accomplish that goal. But then you figure out, how do I get there? Who do I have to maybe nurture a little bit more? And in some cases, you fire the army military attaché who runs around saying he's a spy. I mean, you get a spanking, right? Sometimes you have to spank. But you try to avoid spanking. You try to, again, this is my theme, try and figure out why it's in their interest to do what you want them to do. Whereas I've noticed, because I've had a lot of male bosses, obviously, throughout my career, in many cases, the male boss doesn't care if it's in your interest or not to do what he wants you to do. He just says, do it, and that's it, with no explanation. That's another aspect of, I think, being a female boss, is it's kind of incumbent on you to explain why. Okay, do this, but why? Why should I do this? Well, because it makes sense and this and this and this. And so you kind of get that other person's buy-in, particularly with your subordinates. You don't just tell them what to do as a female boss. You try to kind of, you don't exactly ask for help, because that's a little bit demeaning, but you say, I'd really appreciate it if you did this. Let's do this together. And it just comes across as a little bit more like a family, like a good family, as opposed to a mean family.
Do you want me to ask the last question?
Yeah, I want to say, you
Yeah.
definitely deserve the last question. Also, this way we have gender equity in terms of the question.
Well,
So it's one of my favorite questions to ask. I was just down at POD and I love to ask. So what do you worry about at night so that I can sleep? So what are the big issues? I mean, what should we be thinking? What are you thinking about these days? We have a bunch of current problem solvers. Many of these people many of our students already have distinguished careers. They're going to go into positions of higher authority when they graduate here. And if they do their job correctly, I, as a professor at my desk, should be able to sleep more soundly. So what are some of the issues that are troubling you today that we should be?
Well, this is supposed to be a happy occasion, and I hate to kind of leave this on a downer, but I'm also an honest person. And so if you ask me the question, I'll give you the honest answer. I worry about nuclear war. I worry that we are in 1913 right now, that we're sleepwalking into a situation where there are no off-ramps, where there is no diplomacy, where no one's trying to find any kind of compromise. And okay, I'm not an anti-male person at all, but I would notice that, men tend to not want to blink, not want to listen as much, I think, as women. And we are now in a confrontation where most of the actors are men. I wish, I'll be honest with you, you asked me the question, I wish we had more women dealing with the current crisis. And so I worry about it, because nothing is more dangerous than a cornered animal that has no way out. That's when they launch out. And the situation right now looks like it really could devolve into a nuclear exchange, possibly a tactical nuclear event. But then tactical nukes lead to strategic nukes. Unless somebody blinks, unless somebody says, okay, enough already. Let's just get back to the drawing board. I don't really see any evidence of anybody having that stature, that determination to step back from the brink. So I honestly worry. I was so worried that my husband and I just couldn't talk about anything else, that we just took off for a week to Italy and ate a lot. I mean, seriously, because it's worrisome, and I don't have the magic answer. Again, my answer is always diplomacy. Talk. Don't fight. But I'm not sure that we're not past that point of military. So that's what worries me.
So we need to bring this conversation up. So
Yeah, so you guys have to ask us deep questions, no pressure or anything, but it's better.
introduce yourself.
Let's go.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Alexei Kirov. I'm a visiting scholar here at Fletcher School. I have two quick questions. One is you said Russian diplomats, Russia was always opposed to American presence at Manas. Why do you think that was the case? Was it just that Russia did not want to see Americans there, or were there any specific reasons? And was there any change during the Obama presidency, because there was increased cooperation with Russia over on transit to Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, Russia was not always opposed to Manas. If you recall, what happened after 9/11 was that President Putin actually expressed support for the United States, condolences for what had happened to us. And there was a discussion of, American presence in Central Asia. President Putin was fine with it. So it wasn't always like that. But the situation definitely deteriorated. It's a very complicated discussion of why it deteriorated. I can say that Russia started to feel that the United States was not as supportive as it could be. The United States was at a time of Russian weakness, exploiting that weakness to increase American sphere of influence. Russia started feeling very defensive, saying, wait a minute, if we were to intervene, in Mexico, you probably wouldn't like it. So why are you intervening, in our backyard? Obviously, the American position was, well, you don't have a backyard. Every country's sovereign and independent. That was not Russia's point of view. And again, coming back full circle, well, Russia say, Mexico is your backyard. You want us mucking around. So the situation got worse and worse from that point of view, where Russia started feeling, I think, threatened that they were losing importance, it was really important to the Soviet Union and to its successor, Russia, that there was a bipolar sort of, the two superpowers were there. It was very important psychologically for the pride of the country that it was a superpower. And as after Soviet Union fell apart, I mean, for a while, America was quite clear that it was a unipolar world. Now, some American politicians said that for political gain, but it was not terribly diplomatic. Even if it was true, and it played well with American audiences, it did not play well on the international scene. It got people worried and their backs up and feeling humiliated. And I think a lot of the dynamic over Manas was partly that Russia had agreed initially that Manas was a good idea, and then started feeling that it was an encroachment. And so my job was to try and walk that back to, like I said earlier, to say, no, it's still in your interest. We're still friends, or at least, in this area, we're friends. We want stability in this area together. But I think a lot of international diplomacy, is psychological. It really is psychological. I'll give you a little example from Kyrgyzstan. We did a secret sort of poll, and we the United States, the embassy, and we asked a cross-section of the Kyrgyz population, if you could rejoin the USSR, if you could go back to Soviet period, would you want to? Over 90% said yes. So I was very shocked by that result. I believed the poll, but I was obviously not happy to hear that. I had seen myself how much people had suffered under the Soviet regime. So I was very disappointed that they would want to go back to it. And so I started having in-depth discussions with people, not even, of course, mentioning the poll, but just saying, posing the same question, just one-on-one or with a small group. And one thing that has remained with me is I spoke to one gentleman, one Kyrgyz gentleman, ethnic Kyrgyz, and he said, oh, absolutely, I would want to go back to the USSR. And I said, well, why? He said, well, I'll give you a couple of reasons. First of all, when I was part of the USSR, when I was a Soviet citizen, I was part of a superpower. Now I'm part of a tiny, insignificant country that's being bullied around by anybody who wants to bully us, frankly. And second of all, he said, I'll give you a much more personal reason. My daughter is a really talented, very young, potentially very successful ballet dancer. When I was part of the USSR, I would have sent her to St. Petersburg to study ballet because she's so good. She could have passed all the necessary exams for no money at all. She would have gone to St. Petersburg and become a great ballerina, maybe an international star. Now I'm sitting here in Bishkek with no money, no good ballet school, absolutely no way I can get her into St. Petersburg. And so I have no opportunities for my daughter. That's it. And so that, is part of that whole feeling of we're nobody now, we're downtrodden, we're laughed at, we're humiliated. And so let's get the Americans out of on us. It makes sense, wave it away, in a sad way.
Yeah.
So as Russia's military might is being eroded in Ukraine, first of all, thank you for speaking with us today. I really appreciate it. I'm Marek. I'm a master's candidate at Fletcher School. Spent some time at NACOM this summer. My question, as Russia's military might is being eroded by the war in Ukraine, some former Soviet republics in Central Asia have begun to publicly question Putin's authority and influence in the region. Last week at that summit, the leader of Tajikistan sort of gave Putin this 7-minute long diatribe where he said, we want respect, nothing else, respect. Meanwhile, at the same time, you have China, President Xi personally visited Astana, his first trip since January 2020. And he ends his speech by saying that he categorically comes out against interference by any forces in the internal affairs of your country. To me, that sounds like you are our friend, you're Beijing's friend. Russia, don't mess with our friend. Do you see any potential for tension or even limited conflict in the next 20 years between Russia and China in the region?
Well, that's a very open-ended question. Let me respond by a little story. I find that stories stick in my mind and often in other people's minds as well, more than just geopolitical concepts. So for the past 7 or so years, I've been mentoring a young Chinese girl. She was sent by her very affluent Chinese family to boarding school as a high schooler to the States. Now she's in the university in the DC area. And her parents' plan had always been for her to get a green card, work in America, become an American citizen. And that was kind of their way for her to really excel in the world. And just last week, she came to a symposium of my women's rights organization. And I said, so how's it going? How are your plans? And she said, well, I'm leaving. I'm re-enrolling in a Chinese university. I'm gone. And I said, my God, why? How could you possibly give up on years of effort and go back to China? And she said, well, I followed the advice of my parents. And my parents have told me that it's really a waste of time now to try and become an American citizen, to try and make a life for myself in America, because Russia and America are going to destroy each other. And we, the Chinese, will inherit it. And so why would I want to get nuked in DC when China is by far the most powerful country in the world? And of course, in Central Asia. She knows I was ambassador to Kyrgyzstan. And she said, we don't really expect any kind of trouble from Russia because Russia will have been destroyed basically by the West. So we won't have any trouble at all. And all of the Central Asian countries will just have to listen to us because they will be part of our sphere of influence and will become very, very rich. And I thought, wow, it's very interesting. I've known this girl for years. She's a very sweet, intelligent, good-natured girl. She certainly wasn't saying this to humiliate me or in any way get my goat. She was being very sincere and matter of fact about it. And that's just the way she and her parents, and I would assume a large swath of the Chinese, at least elite, sees things that they don't expect trouble from Russia because Russia will be destroyed by the West. So great, her attitude was, we'll just stand by. We're not going to provoke anybody, do anything to anybody. Just you guys kill each other and we'll inherit it.
Yeah,
So in these conversations about,
identify yourself.
oh, sorry, I'm Alex, Peace Corps volunteer in Kyrgyzstan, so I have a very vested interest in the region. Something I've noticed in the conversations about competition in Central Asia is about influence over the Central Asian states, US influence, Russian influence, Chinese influence. But something that I've noticed that's missing is kind of the agency of Central Asia as these countries. And so I was curious if you can talk about the prospects of not each Central Asian country, but of the Central Asian countries kind of standing up and kind of not having the influence of the other countries over them, or what are the barriers in place that are kind of keeping them from emerging as their own kind of regional actors and regional powers?
Sure. Interesting question. If you recall, in the 19th century, there was an entity called Turkestan, which roughly was Central Asia, and it was kind of roughly united. Had roughly the same, Turkic background. Of course, Tajikistan is Persian ethnic background, but the rest was kind of Turkic. Central areas of civilization, basically of Central Asian civilization, were in Uzbekistan, Bukhara, Samarkand, glorious cities like that with glorious Islamic civilizations, very, very impressive. Now, by no means was Turkestan a democracy. Let's get that straight. But it was certainly a very influential area of the world that had a lot to be proud of, that was not being kicked around. Well, then things sort of went downhill. And what we're seeing now, I think, in Central Asia in particular, something that we're seeing in Africa as well, which is the maleficent post-colonial influence. In Africa, it's obviously the British and the French. In Central Asia, I would describe it to just one person, and that is Joseph Stalin. If you look at the African borders of various countries, often they were created by colonial powers, putting together ethnic groups that had a history of enmity, so that those ethnic groups would be busy fighting each other and not have the wherewithal to fight Paris or London, what have you. Joseph Stalin, I'm not sure if he was a student of British and French colonial action, or if he just had the genius idea on his own. But being an ethnic Georgian and knowing how the Georgians, for example, have had enmity with the Abkhazians, with other Muslim minorities, etc., he kind of grew up with that in mind. He, quite on purpose, created these republics, these Soviet republics, that united groups that had histories of enmity towards each other. And he disunited areas that had historically been united. The Fergana Valley comes to mind. Fergana Valley is characterized by very, I hate to say extreme, let's say very serious Islamic piety. Okay, it has now been, but part of it is in Uzbekistan, which is fine because Uzbekistan is of that religious bent. But part of it is in Kyrgyzstan, and Kyrgyzstan does not have a history of Islamic, how can I put it, enthusiasm. So why did we have a terrible interethnic massacre after the fall of Bakiyev in Kyrgyzstan? Because the Kyrgyz had been waiting, I hate to say it, to massacre their Uzbek minority for quite a while. The USSR itself wouldn't allow that. Then the successor presidents of Kyrgyzstan wouldn't allow that. But then when the power vacuum happened, they proceeded to do some pretty horrific massacres. We look at Nagorno-Karabakh, which is ethnically Armenian, but technically Azeri. I could go on and on about these enclaves, exclaves. You probably know because you lived in Kyrgyzstan, but there are literally exclaves of Uzbekistan in Kyrgyzstan, which make, I mean, no contiguous sense, right? But I truly believe that, having studied Central Asia, that a lot of the borders and the Caucasus as well, a lot of the borders were created on purpose to destabilize, to create entities that had internal enmities within that entity. Now, I think that is a very serious factor as to why these now independent states cannot really have their own agency, because they are very fragile. If somebody comes in and lords over them, like my Chinese friend thinks China will, well, that's one thing. But for them to stand up on their own with the borders as they are now is very, very difficult.
Yes.
My name is Nicola, I'm a second year student at Fletcher. I'd like to ask a bit more about policy in general, the State Department. Drawing from your experience, what are the few ways in which you can see that you'd like to strengthen the State Department, or how would you put diplomacy back or enhance it more so that we can use it?
Interesting question. First of all, money. More money. The State Department is starved for money. It really is. And over my 33 years in the State Department, I've just been overwhelmed by how many other American entities like Treasury, FBI, you name it, has often outsized influence in an embassy because they have more money. And the State Department is always seems to be the poor sister. The State Department's image is, top hat of diplomats pushing cookies. But it's not at all like that. We're constantly begging Congress for more money. So if we had more money, we could do more. Another thing I would definitely think of is that we need more language skills. We do have FSI, the Foreign Service Institute, which does a good job to teach languages, but still we are woefully under languaged up. I mean, I have been in many meetings with my colleagues throughout my career where I was the only one who spoke the local language in that meeting. Everybody else just relied on Foreign Service national translators. Well, those Foreign Service national translators are often excellent. But if you don't know the language, it's difficult to put it in words. Not only obviously can't you communicate directly, you have to go through a translator, but I find that I speak 7 languages. Every language I learn, I get to know something about myself that I didn't know before. It's, I guess, a sort of empathy. But by learning the language, you learn how the other culture speaks, thinks, feels. And so if it's just translation, I mean, it could be an AI program, just tells you what the person said, but not saying it yourself, not hearing it and, internalizing it yourself. It's almost like just reading a book. You lose so much of what diplomacy is about, which is reaching out, dialogue, sensitivity to the other person, or the other group, the other country, the other movement, whatever it is. So again, if I had a magic wand, I would have everyone learn the language. And the two are related because, so you're a GSO, General Services Officer. Your job is to maintain the embassy, maintain the toilets, maintain, whatever it is you're maintaining. Very important job, by the way. But you never get language training. You are assigned, a group of people who repair the electricity, who manage the computers, et cetera, who are locals. And then one of them will speak English, usually. So you talk to that person, and that person says, okay, repair this light socket or whatever. But if you were to speak the local language, you could talk to the guy who repairs the light socket and say, well, how do you feel about the political situation? What's the economy like in your village? How often do you get to see your parents, and how do they, are they surviving? We lose so much of the capacity of our diplomats, because just because you're the general services officer doesn't mean that you don't have political sensitivity or economic interests or cultural interests, you see. So those are the two things that I would say we really need to strengthen: language skills, cultural skills, money skills, so to speak. And I hate to propagate the image of the ugly American, but I think that, and that goes back to cultural skills, a little bit more respect goes a long way. And I think that we don't really teach that much respect for foreign cultures and foreign entities. It's a lot of our diplomacy is based on lecturing, on haranguing. I've spent most of my career in human rights. I'm passionate about human rights. As you know, I'm passionate about women's rights. However, again, there's a way to propagate human rights without coming across as a scold, as a lecturer, as a bad mother. And I think that's the third thing I would say would strengthen our diplomacy, is if we were more sensitive to that opposing point of view. Maybe it's wrong. I mean, I served for years in Saudi Arabia. My God, is the oppression of Saudi women something that absolutely irked me. But I tried to propagate Saudi women's rights without scolding. And I'd like more people to do that.
So why don't we collect a couple of
Yeah, that's what I was
questions?
thinking.
It's only about 10 minutes.
Right. Okay, Honor and then.
Yeah. So yeah, my name's Connor. I've been living and working at the PRC for the past 8 years, and I'll be going back next year as well. So I just wanted to ask, like, in your experience, and obviously, of course, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, Ambassador. But I just want to know if there's anything in particular that you feel like the Chinese don't understand that you wish they would understand about, like, U.S. interests or U.S. values or maybe human rights or anything like that.
Hold on.
Yeah, yes, Ibrahim Al-Bushi, Institute Scholar, Fletcher. My question is about the internal politics of Kyrgyzstan. So this is the only post-Soviet country with two so-called colored revolutions took place in 2000s. So, and there was much speculation inside Russia that the US embassy was directly or indirectly engaged in that social unrest took place in 2005 and 2010. So can you clarify about that or debunk that myth if it's possible? Thanks.
So what does the PRC not understand, and just fess up about the US role in Kyrgyzstan? Yeah.
So on the PRC not understanding, I'll be honest with you, I have the highest respect for Chinese diplomats. In my experience, they understand very well what's going on. They just don't publicize it so much. They are the consummate diplomats in the sense that they're quiet and they listen more than they talk.
Can I push you a little bit on that? Because I mean, I'm vaguely familiar with this whole wolf warrior diplomacy thing. So how does that jibe with what you would, what you're just talking about? That, there are Chinese diplomats who have been very outspoken, not just in social media, but also in various, delegations and so on and so forth. And, this has been a fair amount of news coverage for the last couple of years.
Well, in the last couple of years, you're absolutely right. They're becoming a little bit more, how can I say? Assertive, right. But it's, I don't think it's a question of not understanding. they're just feeling their oats. They're feeling stronger and stronger, and they feel like they're a superpower now. And, they have the same rights as Americans to pound the table and say, yeah, it's not a question of not understanding. It's the question of just being really proud, more and more proud of themselves, and less, when I started out, my very first posting in Warsaw, I remember being invited to the Chinese embassy, and it was very quiet, very secretive. Everything was done behind the scenes, and even in my experience at Manas, there was still some of that. But I do see the trajectory of Chinese diplomacy becoming more and more assertive, especially with their Belt initiative and the way that they're buying up Africa and all kinds of other countries. They're starting to kind of show their game, play their hand openly now, like we are going to be very, very important. But that's not a lack of understanding. That's the fruits of their achievements they've done for many, many years, very, very quietly, and now they feel like they can come out and kind of take a bow. So yes, they're certainly speaking out, but that's just part of I think the fruits of their labors. They're proud of themselves.
And your role in the Kyrgyz Scholar Revolution.
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say that, again, as I mentioned, Joseph Stalin, Kyrgyzstan is a motley sort of assortment of people who don't like each other. There are two main tribal confederations, the Eagle and the Deer, the North and the South. And traditionally, the way peace has been kept is that the presidency oscillates from a gentleman until Rosa Otunbayeva. It was always a gentleman. From the North will be president, and then a gentleman from the South will be president, and then back and forth. And people sort of kept a balance. But it's still, even within these tribal confederations, there's a lot of competition between clans, sub-clans. And the Kyrgyz, interesting characteristic, very, very lovely people, very gentle, very generous. And then suddenly there'll be like a spark. And suddenly there's chaos and awful cruelty, as I mentioned, with respect to the Uzbeks. So I wouldn't call the color revolutions in any way American funded or supported. What we supported was after the result of the Bakiev, basically when Bakiev was chased out of office, we supported under the umbrella of the OSCE with actually the cooperation of the Russian and Chinese embassies. We supported free and fair elections and for the parliament and thereafter for the presidency. But we in no way benefited from this upheaval. I mean, if anything, at one point we were terrified we would lose Manas thanks to this revolution. So what we wanted was stability and obviously respect for human rights. But Kiev was not great on human rights. But we certainly would not have benefited in overthrowing it. No.
I think we have time for one more round of questions. So anyone? Yeah, and then we'll go here. So last shift, go ahead.
My name is Brian. I'm from China, second year MIB. As you mentioned about the Belt initiative that China has launched, buying countries in Africa, how do you see this initiative in the Central Asia? And do you really see this initiative helping these countries economically or in other ways?
Hi, my name is Walter. I'm a current MALT student here at Fletcher, and I recently read a report on Central Asia from the State Department in 2016, where they mentioned the idea briefly of the regional integration, integrating all of Central Asia in a block that would go from there down to Afghanistan and into India and Pakistan. The idea was to connect those countries to ports that could connect them to global markets. At the time, the reports of that policy goal had been a failure. And now that Afghanistan has fallen to the Taliban, it seems to have gotten even worse. Do you think there's any hope for that sort of regional integration to work as a way to get these countries more involved with the global economy?
So first question.
BRI.
Helping
BRI in
the
Central
region.
Asia,
Help
has it
that.
helped the region? And,
Right.
yeah.
Well, it's always a complex picture. Certainly some Chinese investment has been helpful. I specifically will talk about Kyrgyzstan because it's my most recent experience there. On the other hand, there have been some very bad side effects. I'll give you one example. Again, I like little vignettes, little stories. Kyrgyzstan, as I said earlier, is a very poor country. They don't have an alphabet. They use the Cyrillic alphabet. That was only really introduced when the Russian Empire was invited into part of Kyrgyzstan. And here I want to underline, invited. Again, part of the problems between the tribes. One tribe invited the Russians in, and then they never left. Well, then they became Soviet. But it was actually the Kyrgyz who, because they hated the other Kyrgyz, invited the Russians in to, change the balance of power. Anyway, so the Chinese have done, as I said, some good things, but here's the story. The Kyrgyz are poor. They have one main poem. Since they didn't have an alphabet, they couldn't write. So all of their history is oral. They have a main poem called the Manas poem. It's kind of a historical poem, and you add on to it, and the children, especially the boys, are encouraged to learn it by heart. It's a very emotional kind of thing for them. It's the heart of their culture. The second part of their culture, the second ventricle, I guess they have two ventricles, are the yurts. They're made out of yak wool, very intricately embroidered. They're very beautiful. The top of the yurt is on the Kyrgyz flag. That's how important the yurt is to the culture. So you have an oral culture and you have this nomadic culture that is for the two sides of the coin. Well, what have the Chinese been doing? They have been flooding the Kyrgyz market with cheap plastic yurts. And since it's such a poor country, it takes a lot of time, effort, and money to create a yurt. And they don't go cheap, because I bought one, a real felt yurt, yak felt yurt. So I know they're very expensive, but they're worth it. I mean, they're beautiful and they're a symbol. But the Chinese have been just flooding the market with this plastic stuff. And because people are poor, they've started buying this plastic stuff. And it's created at the same, people are complicated. The same one time, on the one hand, they're happy that they at least have a plastic yurt. On the other hand, they're really resentful of China for, flooding them with cheap, basically, not very good goods. I saw the same attitude, not with China, but with Turkey in Turkmenistan, where Turkey was basically sending shoddy stuff, second-rate workmen to, quote unquote, bring Turkmenistan into the first world, and actually exploiting the Turkmen. There's a lot of feeling in Kyrgyzstan, and I believe throughout Central Asia, that China is exploiting them. The Chinese using them as kind of the, treating them like idiots, basically. Oh, here, take this, and give me a fairly good price for it. Another thing that the Kyrgyz, at least, are very worried about is, and again, I don't think that it's necessarily correct to be worried about it, but I heard that so often. Oh, the Chinese are going to send all of their men here and marry our women because they have such a lack of women now because of the one-child policy. And they're just going to flood us and Chinese us, or sinicize us or whatever, and we'll lose all of our women. So there's just a lot of fear of China, a lot of resentment. But at the same time, Who else are they going to turn to? As was mentioned, now that the United States has withdrawn from Afghanistan, the United States doesn't really need Central Asia. Russia is preoccupied with Ukraine. Traditionally, the Kyrgyz, at least, and a lot of other Central Asian countries have played Russia and China off against each other, thereby creating a space for themselves. Now, I think that they feel that space is narrowing. They don't have Russia anymore to play off against China. The Russians are too busy, and they're face to face with China, and they're not going to win against China, either economically or politically. And
So that leads to,
exactly, and that leads to the second question. We were very preoccupied when I was ambassador at Kyrgyzstan with that very same issue. We were talking about electricity grids that would unite, hydro grids that would use Kyrgyz water resources to other areas down to India and Pakistan. Absolutely, to the point where, and this is a bureaucratic issue, but it says a lot. There used to be a European Bureau of the State Department that included Central Asia, because Central Asia was part of the USSR, and the USSR was considered to be part of Europe. Well, when the USSR fell apart, a new bureau was created, the Bureau of Central and South Asia, which united Central Asia with India and Pakistan. And so the bright idea was that, oh, well, just as we bureaucrats have created this new sphere, kind of, so will those countries follow our bureaucratic example. Pretty naive, pretty arrogant. It didn't work at all. And I don't think it will work at all, because these countries have different cultures. They don't like each other in many cases. Within their own country, they don't like each other. So talk about, not liking each other over various countries. So I think it would be a lovely idea. I mean, I would love world government, but I don't think it's going to work at all.
on that note, please join me in thanking Ambassador Gfoeller very much for